The snow fell heavily over New York City, blanketing the streets in a quiet stillness that felt oddly peaceful despite the biting wind that cut through the air. From the top floor of his glass-walled penthouse, Jonathan Whitmore sipped a glass of brandy, his gaze distant as he looked out over the city lights. To anyone else, the view might have been awe-inspiring, but to Jonathan, it was just another night. Wealth and success had afforded him everything, except the one thing that truly mattered: purpose. Jonathan leaned against the cold glass, letting out a long sigh. His life had become a carefully orchestrated series of routines, each one designed to keep him from dwelling on the past. The ache of losing his wife and daughter in a car accident 2 decades ago had faded from sharp pain to a dull, relentless throb. It was easier not to feel anything at all. On a whim, he decided to take a walk, something he rarely did anymore. Bundling up in a dark coat and scarf, he stepped out into the icy night. The streets, usually teeming with life, were eerily quiet, save for the occasional taxi splashing through slush. As he turned the corner toward his building, he saw a small figure huddled against a dumpster in an alleyway. Jonathan slowed, his heart tightening despite himself. The figure was a young girl, no more than 10 years old, shivering violently as she clutched something close to her chest. Her clothes were threadbare, completely inadequate for the weather. He hesitated. He was not the kind of man who stopped for strangers. He had built his empire by focusing on himself, his goals, his needs. Yet something about her vulnerability made it impossible to walk away. "Hey," he called out, his voice firmer than he intended. "What are you doing out here?" The girl flinched and pulled the object in her arms closer. It was a small, battered doll, its face smudged with dirt. I didn't mean to bother anyone," she stammered, her voice barely audible. "You're freezing," Jonathan said, stepping closer. She shrank back, her wide eyes full of fear. "Look, I'm not going to hurt you. Do you have somewhere to go?" She shook her head, biting her lip to stop it from trembling. Against every instinct, Jonathan crouched down, meeting her eye level. "You'll freeze to death out here. My apartment is right there," he said, pointing to the glass tower looming over them. "You can come inside for a little while. Get warm. That's all." She didn't respond immediately, her gaze darting between him and the tower. Finally, with hesitant movements, she nodded. Jonathan led her to the building, his doorman giving him a curious look as they entered. Inside the elevator, the warmth began to thaw her slightly, but she still looked wary, clutching her doll tightly. Once in the penthouse, Jonathan handed her a blanket and made her sit near the fireplace. She didn't speak much, answering his questions with single words or nods. Her name was Emma, and she had been living on the streets for months. When he asked about her family, she clammed up entirely. After ensuring she was comfortable, Jonathan went to his bedroom to let her rest in peace. For reasons he couldn't explain, the image of her clinging to that doll haunted him. It wasn't just pity. It was something deeper, something familiar. The next morning, Jonathan awoke to an empty living room. Emma was gone, but as he walked toward the fireplace, he noticed something. The doll had been left behind, and tucked inside its dress was a small, folded note. He opened it slowly, his chest tightening with a mix of confusion and dread. The handwriting was childish, the message simple. "I was looking for someone who could help. Thank you." Jonathan stared at the note, his mind racing. Who was this girl? Why did she leave so abruptly? And why, despite everything he thought he knew about himself, did he feel an overwhelming urge to find her again? Jonathan sat at the breakfast table, the note still in his hand. He couldn't stop rereading the words, their simplicity digging into him like splinters. It wasn't just her sudden departure that unsettled him. It was the way the note seemed like a cry for help, one he didn't fully understand but couldn't ignore. The doll rested on the table in front of him, its worn fabric and loose stitching a silent reminder of her fleeting presence. He told himself to let it go. She was just a girl, one of countless others struggling to survive in a city that could swallow you whole. But as he pushed his untouched coffee aside and stared out the window at the frosted skyline, he knew he couldn't let it end there. There was something about her, something he couldn't quite name, that wouldn't allow him to forget. By mid-morning, Jonathan had his assistant, Greg, on the phone. Greg was a man accustomed to Jonathan's brusque manner and vague requests, but even he was puzzled by this one. "You want me to find a young girl who showed up at your apartment for one night and left?" Greg asked, his voice tinged with skepticism. "You don't know her last name, where she might have gone, or who her family is?" Jonathan pinched the bridge of his nose. "That's exactly what I'm asking you to do. Her name is Emma. She's about 10 years old, and she left behind a doll and a note. That's all I have." Greg paused, then sighed. "I'll get started. But Jonathan, I have to ask, why is this so important to you?" Jonathan hesitated, searching for an answer he didn't have. Just find her. Over the next several days, Jonathan threw himself into the search with a determination that surprised even him. He called in favors, hired a private investigator, and personally combed through reports from local shelters. Each lead ended in frustration, but with each dead end, his resolve only grew stronger. It wasn't just about the note or the doll anymore. It was about the haunting feeling that he'd let something precious slip through his fingers. One afternoon, his investigator, a grizzled man named Walter, called with a lead. "I found a woman at a shelter in Queens who said she saw a girl matching Emma's description a couple of nights ago. Apparently, the girl was talking about finding someone, a man she thought could help her." Jonathan's chest tightened. "Did she say where Emma might be now?" "No, but she did mention something strange. The girl kept talking about her mother and how this man, whoever she was looking for, was supposed to be someone her mom trusted." Jonathan gripped the phone tighter. "What else did she say?" "Not much. Just that the girl seemed desperate, like she was running out of time." After the call, Jonathan sat in silence, turning Walter's words over in his mind. Emma's mother. Whoever she was, she clearly played a central role in the girl's quest. But why would a child on the streets be so fixated on finding a stranger, especially one she thought her mother trusted? The pieces didn't fit, and yet, deep down, Jonathan felt a pang of familiarity he couldn't shake. That night, as he sat by the fireplace, the doll still on the table beside him, memories he'd buried long ago began to resurface. His daughter, Lily, had owned a doll similar to this one. He remembered how she used to carry it everywhere, even long after most children would have abandoned such things. She had called it Daisy, and he had teased her about it once, earning a playful glare and a defiant declaration. "Daisy isn't just a doll, Dad. She's my best friend." Jonathan rubbed his temples, the memory cutting through him like a blade. He hadn't thought about Lily in years, not really. It was too painful, and he'd become too skilled at locking those emotions away. But now, staring at the doll on his table, he couldn't help but wonder, could Emma's fixation on her mother and the man she trusted have something to do with him? It was absurd, he knew. His daughter had died in that car crash, along with his wife. The police reports, the funeral, they had all confirmed it. And yet, the next morning, Jonathan pressed Walter for an update. Walter's tone was cautious. "I've been digging into missing person reports and cross-referencing anything tied to your name. There's something you should see." Walter handed him a file later that day. Inside were faded records, hospital admissions, orphanage logs, and a photograph that made Jonathan's breath catch in his throat. It was Lily, younger than he remembered, but unmistakably her. The file explained how she had survived the crash but had been taken to an orphanage when no next of kin could be located. She had been listed as a ward of the state, her name eventually disappearing from public records. Jonathan's head spun. How could this have happened? How could his daughter have survived without his knowing? And if this was true, where was she now? Walter's voice broke through his thoughts. "There's more. Based on some of the timelines I've pieced together, it's possible, just possible, that Emma might be connected to her." Jonathan felt the ground shift beneath him. Connected. It was a clinical word for something that could change everything. "You think Emma could be my granddaughter?" Walter nodded. "It's a theory, but if she is, then we're running out of time to find her." Jonathan stared at the photo of Lily, his mind a whirlwind of emotions he hadn't let himself feel in years. Anger at the system that had failed them, grief for the years he had lost, and a fierce, protective determination to find Emma, no matter the cost. He stood abruptly, shoving the file into his briefcase. Keep digging, he told Walter. I don't care what it takes. I'm not losing her again. The streets were colder than Jonathan remembered. He'd spent years insulated from the rawness of the city, shielded by the comforts his wealth afforded. But now, as he walked through dimly lit neighborhoods and past shelters where desperation hung in the air, he felt the weight of every moment Emma might still be out there, vulnerable and alone. Walter had given him another lead earlier that day. A woman working at a community center in the Bronx claimed she had seen a girl matching Emma's description asking for food. Jonathan had driven there immediately, but by the time he arrived, Emma was gone. She always seemed to be one step ahead, like a fleeting shadow he couldn't quite catch. He lingered outside the community center, his breath visible in the icy air. His mind churned with questions that had no easy answers. If Emma was truly his granddaughter, how had it come to this? How had Lily, his daughter, his Lily, been lost to him for so long? And what had her life been like before Emma was born? These were questions he was both desperate to have answered and terrified to confront. A voice broke his thoughts. You looking for someone? Jonathan turned to see a young woman in her 20s, bundled in layers that didn't quite match but seemed practical against the cold. Her name tag read Jenna. She looked at him with a mix of curiosity and suspicion. Yes, Jonathan replied. A girl named Emma, about 10 years old, brown hair, thin. She was here earlier, I think. Jenna frowned, thinking, there was a girl like that, yeah? She didn't say much, just asked if we had any soup left. Looked like she hadn't eaten in a while. Jonathan's heart clenched. Did she say where she was going? No, Jenna said, shaking her head, but she did ask if we knew of any places that were safe to sleep. I told her about a church shelter a few blocks away. She seemed nervous, though, like she didn't want to stay in one place too long. Jonathan felt a flicker of hope. Which shelter? Jenna gave him the address, and he thanked her before rushing back to his car. The streets blurred together as he drove, his mind racing with images of Emma out in the cold, huddled somewhere dark and unsafe. It was a thought he couldn't bear. When he arrived at the shelter, the small chapel beside it was dimly lit, the warm glow of candles visible through the windows. Jonathan pushed open the door, the faint scent of wax and incense meeting him. A few people sat in the pews, their heads bowed, their burdens palpable even in silence. He approached an older man near the altar, who introduced himself as Father Michael. The priest listened patiently as Jonathan described Emma, nodding thoughtfully. She was here last night, Father Michael said. I remember her because she asked for a candle. She said it was for her mother. Jonathan's breath caught. Did she say anything else? Not much. She seemed wary, like she didn't trust anyone. I offered her a place to stay, but she said she couldn't stay long. She lit the candle, said a prayer, and left. Did she mention where she was going? Father Michael hesitated, then shook his head. No, but there was something she said that struck me. She said she was trying to find someone, but she didn't know if he would want her. Jonathan's chest tightened. She said that? The priest nodded. I told her that anyone worth finding would want her, no matter what. She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. She looked so lost. Jonathan ran a hand through his hair, frustration mingling with a deep ache in his chest. She was so close, yet always slipping through his fingers. He couldn't help but think of Lily, how she must have fought to survive, how she must have hoped against all odds that someone would find her, only to end up alone. Father Michael placed a hand on Jonathan's shoulder. If this girl is important to you, don't give up. Sometimes the ones who are hardest to find are the ones who need us most. Jonathan nodded, thanking him before leaving the chapel. The night air bit at his face as he stood outside, staring down the empty street. The city felt impossibly large, the task of finding Emma overwhelming. But he couldn't stop now, not when every step brought him closer to the truth. The next day, Walter called with news. I think I found something, he said. There's a man who runs a food truck near the Lower East Side. He says he saw a girl matching Emma's description yesterday morning. She asked if he'd seen a man who looked like her mom. Jonathan frowned. Her mom? What do you mean? Walter sighed. He said the girl showed him a picture, a faded one. She told him the man she was looking for was someone her mom trusted, someone who would help her. Jonathan's heart raced. And the man, did he recognize the picture? No, Walter said, but he said the girl was determined, almost desperate. He gave her some food and watched her head toward the park. Jonathan felt a mix of hope and dread. Emma wasn't just wandering aimlessly. She was searching for him. She believed he could help her, even though they'd only spent one brief night together. The weight of that trust bore down on him, filling him with both resolve and regret. He drove to the park, scanning the sparse clusters of people huddled near benches and trees. The cold seemed sharper here, the wind cutting through layers like knives. As he walked, his eyes darted from face to face, searching for the one he couldn't forget. And then, just as he was about to give up, he saw her. She was sitting on a bench near the fountain, her small frame barely visible beneath a too-large coat. Her head was bowed, her hands clutching the same battered doll she had left behind in his apartment. Jonathan's breath caught as he approached, his steps hesitant, his heart pounding. When he finally stood in front of her, she looked up, her eyes widening in recognition. "Emma," he said softly, his voice thick with emotion. "I've been looking for you." Tears welled in her eyes, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she said, "I didn't think you'd come." Jonathan knelt in front of Emma, his heart aching at the sight of her trembling hands gripping the doll. She looked so small, so fragile, as if the weight of the world had settled onto her tiny shoulders. Her face was pale, her cheeks hollow from hunger. He wanted to pull her into his arms, to tell her she was safe now, but he held back, unsure of how much she could handle. "I'm here," he said softly, his voice steadier than he felt. "You don't have to be afraid anymore." Emma stared at him, her wide eyes searching his face as if trying to decide whether she could believe him. The silence stretched between them, punctuated only by the distant sound of wind rustling the bare branches above. Finally, she whispered, "Why?" Jonathan blinked, caught off guard. "Why what? Why are you here?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Nobody else ever stayed. Nobody else ever cared." The words hit him like a punch to the chest. He swallowed hard, his throat tight. "Because I care," he said simply. "Because I should have found you sooner." Emma's brow furrowed, confusion flickering across her face. "But you don't even know me." Jonathan hesitated. How could he explain the tangled mess of emotions inside him? How could he tell her that, in a way, he did know her? Because every time he looked at her, he saw a reflection of the family he'd lost. Instead, he chose his words carefully. "I know enough," he said. "I know you're strong and brave, and you've been through more than any child should. And I know you deserve someone who won't let you down." Her lip quivered, but she didn't say anything. Instead, she dropped her gaze to the doll in her lap, tracing its frayed seams with trembling fingers. Jonathan watched her, his heart breaking anew with every second of silence. "Emma," he said gently, "where's your mother?" At that, her head snapped up, and her eyes filled with a pain so raw it made his chest tighten. She shook her head, her small frame trembling. "She's gone," she whispered. "She got sick, and then, she just didn't wake up." Jonathan felt his breath hitch. He wanted to say something, anything, to take away her pain, but he knew words wouldn't be enough. So he stayed quiet, giving her the space she needed. "She always said we'd find him," Emma continued, her voice barely audible. "The man she trusted, the man who would help us." Jonathan frowned. Who was she talking about? Emma hesitated, then reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. She handed it to him without a word. He unfolded it carefully, his eyes widening as he recognized the face in the photograph. It was an old picture of him, taken years ago when Lily was just a child. He remembered that day. They'd gone to the park as a family, and Lily had insisted on taking a picture with him. His hands shook as he stared at the photo. "Where did you get this?" "It was hers," Emma said softly. "She said you were her dad. She said you'd take care of me." Jonathan's throat tightened, and for a moment, he couldn't speak. He looked at Emma, at her small, vulnerable face, and he knew. There was no doubt in his mind. This was his granddaughter, Lily's child. "Emma," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Your mother. She was my daughter." Her eyes widened, and for a moment, she just stared at him. "She said you'd come," she said finally. "She always believed you'd come, even when I didn't." Jonathan's heart broke at her words. He reached out, hesitating for only a moment before placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. "I didn't know," he said, his voice thick with regret. "If I had, I would have found you. I would have found her. I'm so sorry." Emma looked down, her small hands clutching the doll tightly. "I didn't think anyone cared about us," she said, her voice trembling. "It's been so long." Jonathan knelt closer, his voice firm but gentle. "You're not alone anymore. I promise you that." For the first time, Emma's face softened, and she gave a small, hesitant nod. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Jonathan stood, holding out his hand. "Come on," he said. "Let's get you somewhere warm. We'll figure everything out together." She hesitated, then slipped her small hand into his. The trust in that simple gesture made his chest tighten with emotion. He led her back to his car, wrapping his coat around her shoulders as they walked. Once inside, he turned up the heat, watching as she curled into the seat, exhaustion etched into every line of her small frame. As he drove, he glanced at her in the rearview mirror. She was already drifting off to sleep, her head resting against the window, the doll cradled in her arms. For the first time in years, Jonathan felt something shift inside him, a flicker of hope, of purpose. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew one thing for certain. He wouldn't fail her. Not this time. When they arrived back at his apartment, he carried her inside, careful not to wake her. He laid her on the couch, covering her with a blanket and placing the doll beside her. As he stood there, watching her sleep, he made a silent vow. He would find out what had happened to Lily. He would piece together the years they had lost, and he would do whatever it took to give Emma the life she deserved. For the first time in years, Jonathan felt the faint stirrings of something he thought he'd lost forever. Hope. It was fragile and uncertain, but it was enough to carry him forward. Jonathan sat at his desk, the photograph of Lily and the small doll resting in front of him. Emma was asleep in the guest room, her exhaustion finally overpowering her guarded nature. The faint sound of her steady breathing carried through the quiet apartment, grounding him as he stared at the files spread out across his desk. Walter had delivered more documents that afternoon, piecing together the fragments of Lily's life after the accident. The details were murky, filled with gaps and inconsistencies. It seemed Lily had spent years moving from place to place, surviving under difficult circumstances. The records painted a picture of a young woman trying to protect her child while grappling with hardships Jonathan could scarcely imagine. One document caught his eye, a medical record from a hospital in upstate New York. It was dated a year ago, listing Lily as the patient. The diagnosis was clear: late-stage cancer. Jonathan's chest tightened as he read the clinical notes. She had been sick, likely for a long time, and she'd been fighting to stay alive for Emma's sake. The realization hit him like a blow. His daughter had suffered in silence, and he hadn't been there to help her. The anger that followed was sharp and bitter. He directed it at himself, at the system that had failed to reunite them, at the choices that had kept him isolated in his high-rise fortress. He had spent years building walls to protect himself from pain, only to find that those walls had also kept him from the people he loved most. His phone buzzed, breaking the silence. It was Walter again. "I've got something else for you," Walter said, his tone cautious. "It's about Emma." Jonathan gripped the phone tighter. "What is it?" "There's a pattern in the places she's been staying. Shelters, food trucks, even the community centers. It seems like she's been avoiding certain areas. I cross-referenced the locations, and I think I know why." Jonathan's stomach sank. "Go on." "There's a man," Walter said. "His name's Victor Nolan. He's not a good guy. He runs a group that preys on vulnerable kids, promising them safety but using them for his own purposes. From what I can tell, he knew Lily, probably manipulated her into owing him something. After she passed, it looks like he started looking for Emma. I think she's been running from him." Jonathan's grip on the phone turned to steel. "Why would he want Emma?" "My guess? Leverage. Money. You're her grandfather, and he knows it. He may not have made the connection yet, but he's closing in. Jonathan's blood ran cold. Where is he? I've got a few leads. But, Jonathan, if you're thinking of confronting him, you need to be careful. This guy doesn't play by the rules. Jonathan didn't respond. His mind was already racing, formulating a plan. He wasn't going to sit back and wait for this man to find Emma. He had failed Lily, but he wouldn't fail her daughter. That evening, after ensuring Emma was comfortable and eating something warm, Jonathan sat down with her in the living room. She watched him cautiously, her fingers fiddling with the doll in her lap. I need to ask you something, he began gently. About a man named Victor Nolan. Her hands froze, and her eyes filled with fear. I don't know him, she said quickly, her voice trembling. Jonathan leaned forward, his voice calm but firm. Emma, it's okay. You don't have to be afraid anymore. He can't hurt you here. Tears welled in her eyes, and she hugged the doll closer. He came after us, she whispered. After Mama got sick. She didn't want to owe him anything, but he wouldn't leave us alone. She told me to run if anything happened to her. Jonathan's chest tightened. He reached out, resting a hand on her shoulder. You did the right thing, he said. You were so brave, but you don't have to run anymore. I'll make sure he never comes near you again. Her gaze searched his face, as if trying to decide whether she could trust him. Slowly, she nodded, but the fear didn't leave her eyes. After putting her to bed that night, Jonathan called Walter again. I want everything you have on Nolan, he said. I don't care what it costs or who you have to call. Walter sighed. I figured you'd say that. I'll send over what I've got. But Jonathan, be careful. This isn't just some business deal. Jonathan's voice was cold. I know exactly what it is. The following day, Jonathan delved into Walter's reports. Nolan's network was extensive, built on intimidation and exploitation. He had a history of targeting people like Lily, vulnerable, desperate, without anyone to turn to. Jonathan felt a surge of anger that was almost blinding. He thought of Lily, sick and scared, trying to protect her daughter from a man like this. He thought of Emma, running from shadow to shadow, too afraid to stay in one place for long. And he thought of himself, safe in his penthouse, oblivious to the hell they had been living through. It was unacceptable, and it was going to end. By evening, Jonathan had a plan. He wasn't just going to protect Emma. He was going to ensure that Nolan's operation was dismantled for good. He called in a team of trusted associates, people he'd worked with in the past who knew how to handle situations like this. He also reached out to law enforcement contacts, leveraging his influence to set things in motion. As he prepared, he kept an eye on Emma, who seemed to sense the shift in his demeanor. She stayed close to him, her small presence a reminder of why he was doing this. Every time he saw her face, he felt his resolve strengthen. That night, as she drifted off to sleep on the couch, Jonathan sat beside her, watching over her like a guardian. He promised himself that no matter what it took, he would ensure her safety. He had lost too much already. He wasn't going to lose her too. The city lights outside glittered like stars, their cold brilliance reflecting the fire burning inside him. Jonathan Whitmore was a man used to winning. And this time, he wasn't just fighting for himself. He was fighting for his family. Jonathan moved swiftly, coordinating with Walter and his team while ensuring Emma remained unaware of the brewing storm. She was still too fragile, her trust in him tentative and hard-won. He wasn't about to burden her with the details of the danger she had escaped or the confrontation looming ahead. Instead, he focused on making her feel safe, creating a temporary cocoon of normalcy in his otherwise sterile, oversized apartment. Emma began to relax, little by little. She started speaking more, though her words were still hesitant, her eyes darting to him as if gauging whether he would keep his promises. Jonathan found himself cherishing these small victories. The way she accepted the plate of pancakes he made one morning, the shy smile she gave him when he handed her a new set of clothes, the first time she asked if they could watch a movie together. These moments were a fragile thread connecting them, but they gave him hope that he could build something real with her. But beneath the surface, he was boiling with urgency. Nolan was a threat, and Jonathan couldn't rest until the man was dealt with. Walter's reports had detailed the extent of Nolan's operations, a tangled web of exploitation and cruelty that preyed on the vulnerable. It made Jonathan sick to think that Lily had been ensnared in that web, her final years marked by fear and desperation. He couldn't change what had happened to her, but he could ensure that Emma never had to look over her shoulder again. One evening, as Emma sat cross-legged on the living room rug, playing with the doll she had refused to part with, Jonathan received a call from Walter. He stepped into his office, closing the door behind him. "We've got him," Walter said, his tone grim but triumphant. "He's staying at a warehouse in Queens. It's one of his central hubs. I've got enough evidence to tip off the authorities. But if you want to confront him first, now's your chance." Jonathan gripped the edge of his desk, his jaw tightening. "I'm going," he said without hesitation. "Send me the address." Walter hesitated. "You sure that's a good idea? This guy's dangerous, Jonathan. He's not just going to roll over because you show up." "I don't need him to roll over," Jonathan said coldly. "I just need him to know that Emma isn't his to exploit. Ever." Walter sighed. "All right, just be careful, and let me know when you're on your way back." Jonathan ended the call and leaned against the desk, closing his eyes. He took a deep breath, forcing himself to steady his thoughts. This wasn't just about revenge or even justice. It was about making sure Emma had a future free from fear. That night, after making sure Emma was asleep, Jonathan left the apartment. He didn't tell her where he was going. He couldn't risk upsetting her. Instead, he tucked her doll beside her and whispered, "I'll be back soon." The drive to Queens was quiet, the city's usual chaos muted by the late hour. When he arrived at the warehouse, he parked a block away and approached on foot, his breath visible in the frigid air. The building was dimly lit, its windows barred, the faint hum of activity coming from within. He could feel the tension in the air, the sense that this was a place where people disappeared, where lives unraveled. Jonathan didn't hesitate. He entered through a side door Walter's team had flagged as unguarded, his steps deliberate and silent. Inside, the warehouse was a maze of crates and machinery, the smell of oil and dust heavy in the air. He could hear voices in the distance, gruff, male, laced with cruelty. Nolan was here. He could feel it. He moved toward the sound, his heart pounding but his resolve unshaken. When he finally saw Nolan, the man was sitting at a makeshift desk, surrounded by lackeys who laughed at some crude joke he just made. He was exactly the kind of man Jonathan had imagined, arrogant, brutish, and utterly without remorse. Jonathan stepped forward, his presence immediately drawing attention. The laughter died, and Nolan's head snapped up, his eyes narrowing as he took in the intruder. Well, Nolan drawled, leaning back in his chair. "If it isn't the big man himself, to what do I owe this unexpected pleasure?" Jonathan's voice was cold, measured. "You know why I'm here." Nolan smirked, spreading his arms wide. "Do I? Enlighten me." "Emma," Jonathan said, his tone hard as steel. "You will never go near her again. Not now, not ever." Nolan's smirk faltered, replaced by a glint of suspicion. "Emma? Huh? Cute kid. Reminds me of her mother." Jonathan's fists clenched at the casual cruelty in the words. "You don't get to talk about her." "Relax, Mr. Whitmore," Nolan said, leaning forward. "I'm not unreasonable. All I want is what's fair. You're a rich man. I'm sure we can come to an arrangement." Jonathan stepped closer, his eyes blazing. "There's no arrangement. You're done. Your operation, your threats, your games. They end tonight." Nolan chuckled, though there was a nervous edge to it now. "Big talk, but you're just one man. You really think you can take me down?" Jonathan's gaze didn't waver. "Watch me." Before Nolan could respond, the sound of sirens pierced the air. Nolan's smug expression collapsed, replaced by panic as he realized what was happening. Jonathan's team had called in the police, ensuring that Nolan's crimes would be exposed. As officers stormed the warehouse, Nolan's men scattered, leaving their leader to face the consequences alone. Jonathan stood back, watching as Nolan was handcuffed and led away. The sight filled him with a grim satisfaction. It wouldn't bring back Lily, but it was a step toward justice, a promise kept to the family he had failed. When Jonathan returned home, the apartment was quiet. Emma was still asleep, the doll cradled in her arms. He sat beside her for a moment, brushing a strand of hair from her face. For the first time in weeks, he felt a measure of peace. Nolan was gone, and Emma was safe. But this was only the beginning. There were still wounds to heal, questions to answer, and a future to build. Jonathan didn't know what the road ahead would look like, but as he watched Emma sleep, he knew one thing for certain. They would face it together. The days after Nolan's arrest were quiet, yet heavy with the unspoken weight of everything Jonathan and Emma had endured. Jonathan did his best to create a sense of normalcy, but the cracks in their fragile new life together were evident. Emma was still cautious, her movements hesitant, as though she wasn't quite convinced that the ground beneath her feet was stable. Jonathan couldn't blame her. Stability had been a foreign concept in her life for too long. He began spending more time at home, delegating his business responsibilities to trusted associates. For once, the towering empire he had built seemed less important than the small, vulnerable girl who had brought him back to life. He arranged for Emma to see a doctor, ensuring her health was intact after months of surviving on scraps and the generosity of strangers. He hired a tutor to help her catch up on her education, though her nervousness around strangers made it a slow process. But it was in the quiet moments, when it was just the two of them, that Jonathan saw glimpses of the little girl beneath the layers of fear and loss. She began asking him questions, tentative at first, then with growing curiosity. She wanted to know about her mother, about the life Lily had lived before everything fell apart. Jonathan answered as best he could, though each memory he shared felt like a double-edged sword, cutting through the grief he had buried while also bringing back the warmth of the love he had lost. She loved the park, he told Emma one evening as they sat by the fire. When she was about your age, she used to beg me to take her every Saturday. She'd bring that old doll of hers, Daisy, and insist on having a picnic, even if it was freezing outside. Emma's eyes lit up at the mention of the doll. I think I have her, she said softly, holding up the tattered toy she still carried everywhere. Jonathan smiled, his chest tightening. You do. That doll was her favorite thing in the world. Emma looked down at the doll, running her fingers over its worn fabric. She used to tell me stories about you, she said. She said you were strong and smart and kind. Even when things got hard, Jonathan's throat tightened. She said that? Emma nodded. She told me that you would have come for us if you'd known. The words pierced him, filling him with both guilt and gratitude. She was right, he said quietly. If I had known, I would have done anything to find you. Emma's gaze softened, and for the first time, Jonathan felt a flicker of something he hadn't dared hope for, trust. It wasn't complete, not yet, but it was a start. As the days turned into weeks, their bond grew stronger. Jonathan began taking Emma to the park on weekends, honoring the tradition he had shared with Lily. At first, she was hesitant, clinging to his side as they walked along the winding paths. But gradually, she began to relax, her laughter breaking through the stillness that had surrounded her for so long. One crisp afternoon, as they sat on a bench near the fountain, Emma asked, "Do you think she's happy now?" Jonathan frowned, unsure of her meaning. "Who, sweetheart?" "My mom," Emma said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Do you think she knows I'm okay?" Jonathan felt a lump rise in his throat. "I think she knows," he said gently. "And I think she's proud of you. She always wanted you to be safe and happy. That's what I want too." Emma leaned against him, her small frame fitting perfectly against his side. "I miss her," she said, "but I'm glad I have you." Jonathan's chest tightened, and he wrapped an arm around her, pulling her close. "I'm glad I have you too," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You've brought me back to life, Emma. I didn't even realize how lost I was until you found me." As they sat there, watching the sunlight dance on the water, Jonathan realized that this was what he had been missing all along. Not the endless cycle of meetings and acquisitions, not the hollow victories of his business empire. It was this, a connection, a purpose, a chance to make things right. That evening, back at the apartment, Emma surprised him by bringing out an envelope she had been hiding in her small backpack. "This was hers," she said, handing it to him. "She told me to keep it safe." Jonathan opened the envelope with care, his hands trembling slightly. Inside was a letter written in Lily's handwriting, the paper worn and creased from being folded so many times. He began to read, his eyes scanning the familiar loops and curves of her script. "Dad, if you're reading this, it means Emma found you. I always knew she would. I'm sorry I couldn't bring her to you myself, but I hope you'll understand that I did everything I could to protect her. She's so much like you, strong, stubborn, and kind, even when life isn't fair. I hope she reminds you of the good times, of the love we shared as a family. Please take care of her. She's all I have, and I know she'll be everything to you too. With all my love, Lily." Jonathan's vision blurred as he finished the letter, the weight of Lily's words pressing against his heart. He looked up at Emma, who was watching him with wide, uncertain eyes. "She always believed in you," Emma said softly. "Even when I didn't think you were real." Jonathan knelt in front of her, his hands resting gently on her small shoulders. "I'm real," he said firmly, "and I'm here now. I'm not going anywhere." Emma nodded, a tear slipping down her cheek. She leaned forward, wrapping her arms around his neck in a hug that was as much an offering as it was a request. Jonathan held her tightly, his own tears falling silently. In that moment, he felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. Lily's words, Emma's trust, the bond they were building. It was all a testament to the resilience of love, even in the face of loss. He didn't know what the future held, but for the first time, he felt ready to face it, with Emma by his side. The next morning, sunlight streamed through the apartment's floor-to-ceiling windows, casting a warm glow over the living room. Emma was at the kitchen counter, eating a bowl of cereal, her legs swinging under the stool. It was a small, ordinary moment, but to Jonathan, it felt extraordinary. He watched her from across the room, marveling at how far they had come in just a few weeks. She caught him looking and tilted her head. "What?" she asked, her tone a mix of curiosity and amusement. Jonathan smiled, shaking his head. "Nothing. Just, you seem happier." Emma shrugged but didn't look away. "I think I am," she admitted quietly. "It's weird, though. I keep waiting for something bad to happen." Jonathan crossed the room and sat beside her. "Nothing bad is going to happen," he said firmly. "Not while I'm here." She studied him for a moment, as if testing the truth of his words, then nodded. "Okay." The simplicity of her trust struck Jonathan to his core. It was fragile, hard-won, but it was there. He wasn't sure he deserved it. Not yet, but he was determined to earn it fully. After breakfast, they spent the day at the park again, feeding the ducks and walking along the paths. Emma's laughter came more easily now, and she even ran ahead at times, her arms outstretched like wings. Jonathan watched her with a mixture of pride and heartache. She was still a child, despite everything she had endured, and he wanted to protect that spark of innocence at all costs. Later that afternoon, they stopped at a small cafe near the park. Jonathan ordered hot chocolate for both of them, and they sat by the window, watching people bustle by on the street. Emma wrapped her hands around her mug, savoring the warmth. "Did my mom like hot chocolate?" she asked suddenly. Jonathan smiled. "She loved it, especially with extra marshmallows." Emma grinned. "Me too." They sat in companionable silence for a while, the kind that felt natural despite how new their relationship was. It was a quiet reminder of the bond they were building, one small moment at a time. As they walked back to the car, Emma slipped her hand into his. The simple gesture made Jonathan's chest tighten with emotion. It was the first time she had reached out to him, unprompted, and it felt like a breakthrough. He squeezed her hand gently, his heart swelling with a fierce determination to protect her. When they returned to the apartment, they found a package waiting at the door. Jonathan picked it up, frowning slightly at the lack of a return address. Inside, he found a small, neatly wrapped box and a note. The handwriting was unfamiliar, but the message was clear. "You might have taken Nolan out of the picture, but there are others who won't let this go. Be careful who you trust." Jonathan's stomach dropped as he reread the note. He knew this wasn't an idle threat. Taking down Nolan had been a victory, but it was also a reminder that the world Lily and Emma had lived in was far more dangerous than he had realized. There were still people out there who would see Emma as a pawn, a means to an end. He glanced at Emma, who was unpacking her small backpack in the living room, blissfully unaware of the threat looming over them. For her sake, he couldn't let his fear show. He tucked the note into his pocket, vowing to address it later. That evening, Jonathan called Walter to discuss the note. "Whoever sent this knows about Nolan," he said, his voice low as he paced his office. "They know what I've been doing." Walter sighed on the other end of the line. It was bound to happen. Taking down someone like Nolan doesn't go unnoticed. But if they're sending warnings, it means they're not ready to move against you directly. They're testing the waters. Jonathan's jaw tightened. "I'm not going to let them get anywhere near her." "I didn't think you would," Walter said. "But you need to be smart about this. You've already made waves. Whoever's left in Nolan's circle is going to be watching you." Jonathan ran a hand through his hair, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. "Do we know who's behind this?" "Not yet, but I'm working on it," Walter said. "In the meantime, keep her close. Don't let her out of your sight." "I wasn't planning to," Jonathan said, his voice firm. "Let me know as soon as you find anything." After ending the call, Jonathan sat in his office, staring at the note. He hated the idea of living in fear, of always looking over his shoulder. But more than that, he hated the thought of Emma being in danger again. He had promised her safety, and he intended to keep that promise, no matter the cost. The next morning, he began taking precautions. He installed additional security measures in the apartment and hired a discreet but experienced bodyguard to watch over Emma whenever they left the building. He didn't tell her the full extent of the measures, not wanting to alarm her, but she seemed to notice the shift in his demeanor. "Are you okay?" she asked one evening as they watched a movie together. Jonathan forced a smile. "Of course. Just making sure everything's perfect for you." She tilted her head, studying him in that unnervingly perceptive way she had. "You don't have to worry so much," she said softly. "I'm not scared anymore." Jonathan swallowed hard, his chest tightening at her words. "That's because you're brave," he said. "But it's my job to make sure you don't have to be." Emma seemed to accept that, leaning against him as they watched the rest of the movie. But Jonathan knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. There were still shadows lurking, threats he couldn't yet see. But for now, he focused on the girl beside him, her trust in him a beacon that guided his every decision. He had made mistakes, lost years he could never get back. But with Emma, he had a second chance, a chance to make things right, to build a future where she could thrive. And for her, he would face whatever came next, no matter what. Days turned into weeks, and the rhythm of life began to settle into something resembling normalcy. Emma continued to grow more comfortable in her new surroundings, her laughter becoming a regular presence in the apartment. She had even started making small requests, her favorite breakfast, a trip to the bookstore, or an extra hour of movie time before bed. Jonathan indulged every request without hesitation, relishing each moment that reminded him of how much she was healing. But he wasn't naive. The note left at their door still lingered in his mind, a reminder that the safety they had begun to build was fragile. Walter continued his investigation, uncovering fragments of information about the remnants of Nolan's network. It seemed Nolan's operation had left behind a power vacuum, one that others were eager to fill. Jonathan knew they would come looking for Emma eventually. She was too valuable, a link to his wealth, a potential bargaining chip. He wouldn't let that happen. One Saturday morning, as sunlight poured into the living room, Emma approached Jonathan with her hands behind her back, a shy smile playing on her lips. "I made you something," she said. Jonathan raised an eyebrow, setting down the newspaper he had been reading. "You did? Let's see it." She revealed a small, hand-drawn picture. It was simple but heartfelt, the two of them standing side by side, a bright yellow sun in the corner of the page and a heart floating above their heads. In clumsy but endearing handwriting, she had written, "Me and Grandpa." Jonathan stared at the picture, his throat tightening. He looked up at her, seeing the nervous anticipation in her eyes, as if she wasn't sure how he would react. "This is the best thing anyone's ever given me," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you, Emma." Her face lit up with a smile, and she wrapped her arms around him in a hug. It was the first time she had called him Grandpa, and the words settled deep in his heart, filling a void he hadn't even realized was still there. The moment was interrupted by the buzz of his phone. Jonathan frowned as he saw Walter's name on the screen. He hesitated, not wanting to break the moment, but the urgency in Walter's voice during their last call made him pick up. "We've got a problem," Walter said without preamble. "Nolan's second-in-command, a man named Rick Torres, is trying to reorganize what's left of the operation. He's been asking questions about you and about Emma." Jonathan's jaw tightened. "What kind of questions?" "Where you live, what kind of security you have if Emma's with you." He's not being subtle, which means he's probably planning something. Jonathan glanced toward the living room, where Emma was now sitting on the floor, coloring another picture. He lowered his voice. "Do you know where he is?" Walter sighed. "Not yet, but I've got people on it. My advice? Stay put, keep her close, and don't let your guard down." "Thanks," Jonathan said, ending the call. He slipped the phone into his pocket, his mind already racing. Torres was a new threat, but he wasn't going to let fear dictate their lives. Not again. That evening, Jonathan sat Emma down after dinner. He kept his tone calm, not wanting to alarm her, but he knew he needed to prepare her. "Emma, I need to talk to you about something important," he began. She looked up from her plate, her brow furrowing slightly. "What is it?" "There are some people, bad people, who might want to find us," he said. "They used to work with Nolan, and now that he's gone, they're looking for ways to cause trouble." Emma's face paled, and she clutched her doll tightly. "Are they coming for me?" Jonathan reached across the table, taking her hand in his. "No," he said firmly. "I won't let them, but I need you to listen to me. If I ever tell you to hide or go to a safe place, you need to do it right away. Can you promise me that?" She nodded slowly, her eyes wide. "Okay." Jonathan forced a reassuring smile. "Good. But remember, you're safe here. I won't let anyone hurt you." Emma seemed to relax a little, though the tension in her small frame didn't entirely disappear. Jonathan hated that he had to have this conversation with her, but he knew it was necessary. He couldn't risk underestimating the danger. The following week passed uneventfully, but Jonathan remained on high alert. He increased the building's security, installed surveillance cameras, and made sure the bodyguard he had hired was always nearby when they left the apartment. He even began reviewing his own schedule, canceling unnecessary meetings and commitments so he could spend more time at home. One evening, as he sat in his office, Walter called again. "We found Torres," Walter said. "He's holed up in a motel outside the city, probably trying to stay off the radar." "He doesn't know we're watching him." Jonathan exhaled slowly, the tension in his chest loosening slightly. "What's the plan?" "My team's coordinating with the authorities," Walter said. "We're going to shut him down before he can make a move. Just sit tight and let us handle it." Jonathan nodded, though he couldn't shake the feeling of unease. He trusted Walter, but the thought of leaving Emma's safety in someone else's hands made his stomach churn. Still, he forced himself to wait, knowing that patience was the best course of action. That night, as Emma slept soundly in her room, Jonathan stood by the window, looking out at the city. The view had always been a source of pride for him, a symbol of everything he had achieved. But now, it felt like a reminder of how isolated he had become. For years, he had lived above the world, untouchable but alone. Now, with Emma in his life, he realized how hollow that existence had been. He turned away from the window, his gaze falling on the drawing Emma had given him. "Me and Grandpa." The words filled him with a fierce determination. He had already lost Lily. He wouldn't lose Emma too. As he walked to his room, he paused by Emma's door. He opened it quietly, peeking in to see her curled up under the covers, the doll tucked against her chest. Her soft breathing filled the room, and Jonathan felt a swell of love so strong it nearly brought him to his knees. He closed the door gently, his mind set. No matter what came next, he would protect her. He would keep the promise he had made, to her, to Lily, and to himself. The next morning, Jonathan awoke to an early phone call from Walter. The tension in Walter's voice was unmistakable, sending a chill through Jonathan before he even heard the words. "Torres is making his move," Walter said quickly. "He's been seen heading toward the city. We don't know his exact target, but given how focused he's been on Emma, I don't think it's a coincidence. Jonathan's grip on the phone tightened, his heart pounding. How long do we have? Not long, Walter admitted. I've alerted the authorities, but you need to stay vigilant. Make sure Emma's somewhere secure. Jonathan thanked him and hung up, his mind racing. He didn't want to panic Emma, but he knew they couldn't stay in the apartment without a plan. He knocked gently on her door, opening it to find her still asleep, her small figure curled under the covers. Emma, he said softly, kneeling by her bedside. Sweetheart, we need to go somewhere for a little while. She stirred, blinking sleepily. What's wrong? She asked, her voice groggy. Nothing you need to worry about, he said, keeping his tone calm. I just want to make sure we're safe. Okay. She sat up slowly, her eyes widening slightly as she searched his face. Is it the bad people? Jonathan hesitated, then nodded. Yes, but I promise, I won't let anything happen to you. Emma nodded, trusting him completely. She slid out of bed, clutching her doll tightly as he helped her gather a few things. Within minutes, they were in the car, heading to a safe house Walter had arranged. It was a modest, unassuming townhouse in a quiet neighborhood, far from the bustling city center. Jonathan had hired additional security to patrol the area, ensuring that no one could get close without being noticed. As they settled into the house, Jonathan tried to keep the mood light for Emma's sake. He made her pancakes in the small kitchen and played a board game with her in the living room, but his mind was elsewhere, focused on the threat still looming over them. Every creak of the floorboards, every distant sound from outside, set his nerves on edge. By late afternoon, the tension reached its peak. Jonathan's phone buzzed with a text from Walter. Torres spotted near your building. He's looking for you. Stay put. Jonathan's jaw clenched as he read the message. He looked at Emma, who was drawing at the coffee table, oblivious to the danger closing in. He couldn't let her live in fear, not after everything she had already endured. This had to end. He stepped outside to make a call, instructing Walter to keep him updated. If Torres gets any closer, I need to know, he said firmly. We're on it, Walter replied. Just stay safe. As the evening approached, the tension became almost unbearable. Jonathan tried to distract himself by helping Emma prepare for bed, but his mind kept circling back to the threat. After she was asleep, he sat in the living room, staring out the window at the dark street below. His phone buzzed again, and this time it wasn't Walter. The number was unlisted, but the message was chilling. You can't hide her forever. Jonathan felt a surge of anger. He was done hiding, done waiting for the next move. He called Walter. I want this over, he said, his voice low and determined. I'm not going to let Torres keep us looking over our shoulders. Walter sighed. I was hoping you'd say that. We've tracked him to an old industrial site on the outskirts of the city. He's holed up there, probably planning his next move. If you want to confront him, now's your chance. Jonathan didn't hesitate. Send me the address. Within an hour, he was on the road, his bodyguard driving while Walter kept him updated. The industrial site was a sprawling complex of crumbling buildings and rusted machinery, the kind of place where shadows lingered even in daylight. Jonathan stepped out of the car, his jaw set, his resolve unshaken. Inside, the air was heavy with the smell of oil and decay. Torres was waiting for him in a large, dimly lit room, flanked by a few men who looked more like hired muscle than loyal allies. Torres's smirk widened as Jonathan approached. Well, look who decided to show up, Torres said, his voice dripping with mockery. The big man himself. Jonathan kept his voice steady. This ends now. You're not coming near her. Not ever. Torres laughed, a low, menacing sound. You think you can just walk in here and tell me what to do? You've got no idea what you're up against. Jonathan stepped closer, his eyes cold. I know exactly what I'm up against, and I'm not afraid of you. The tension in the room crackled like electricity. Jonathan's bodyguard and Walter's team moved in from the shadows, surrounding Torres and his men before they could react. The tables turned in an instant, and the smug confidence on Torres's face was replaced by panic. You made a mistake coming after her, Jonathan said, his voice low and firm. That little girl has been through enough. You don't get to use her. Not now, not ever. Torres tried to bluster his way out, but it was clear he had lost. The authorities arrived moments later, taking Torres and his men into custody. Jonathan watched in silence as they were led away, his fists clenched at his sides. It was over. The threat was gone. When Jonathan returned to the safe house, it was past midnight. Emma was still asleep, her small form curled up under the blankets. He sat beside her bed, watching her breathe, the weight of the night finally lifting from his shoulders. The next morning, Emma woke to find him sitting at the kitchen table, a rare smile on his face. "Is everything okay?" she asked, rubbing her eyes. Jonathan nodded. "Everything's okay now. You're safe." Emma climbed onto his lap, wrapping her arms around his neck. "I knew you'd keep me safe," she said softly. Jonathan held her close, his heart full. For the first time in years, he felt a sense of peace. The danger was behind them, and the future stretched out before them. A future he would face with Emma by his side, no matter what. It wasn't just the end of a fight. It was the beginning of a life they could finally build together. A life filled with love, trust, and the promise of brighter days ahead.